Welcome to the Explainer. Today we're taking a really deep dive, a rigorous academic breakdown actually, into Thema 23, Simultaneity, Anteriority, and Poseteriority. Now I know that sounds like a mouthful, but this topic is absolutely crucial if you're aiming for C2 level English mastery. We're talking about the sophisticated architecture of English temporal expressions. You know, a lot of times we just think of time in language as basic past, present, and future verb tenses. But as we'll see today, true linguistic proficiency means navigating the complex flow of time through a much richer, multi-layered system. We're going to explore the fascinating structural and semantic intricacies of how we express events happening at the exact same time before or after a specific reference point. So let's get into it.
Here's our roadmap for today's lecture. We're going to start with some foundational concepts about the architecture of time, and then we'll break down the three main temporal pillars: simultaneity, anteriority, and posteriority. Finally, we'll wrap up by looking at exactly how you can apply all of this practically, whether that's in the EOI classroom or in advanced professional contexts.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the architecture of time. And remember, this is about way more than just verb tenses.
Okay, before we get into the real weeds here, we need to completely reframe how we think about time in English. Let's lock in these fundamental academic definitions right off the bat. Simultaneity, that's when events are concurrent, happening at the same time. Anteriority is when an event precedes or happens before our reference point. And posteriority is when an event is subsequent or happens after that reference point. But here's the real kicker. For beginners, time is basically just changing eat to ate, right? But at the C2 level, expressing these three dimensions relies on a highly intricate system. It's built on prepositional groups, subordinate clauses, and even morphological processes like prefixation. It's literally syntax and morphology working together. Grasping how these structural elements interact is exactly what separates a pretty good English speaker from an absolute master.
Moving on to Section 2, let's talk about simultaneity and how we navigate parallel timelines. So for our first pillar, simultaneity, we're looking at how English conveys two things happening at the exact same time. We mostly do this through prepositions and subordinators. The framework proposed by linguists Downing and Locke is just brilliant for this. They categorize prepositional groups based entirely on how they anchor an event to time. The basic job of a preposition here is to be a temporal adverbial. Let's walk through how we can narrow this down semantically. We start broad with a continuous period. It rained during the summer. But what if we want to squeeze an event strictly inside a wider time frame? We shift it. The project will be finished within July. And if we need absolute mathematical precision, a highly specific point in time, we rely on at or on, like the meeting starts at 5 p.m. It's this beautifully logical system of zeroing in on temporal overlap.
Now let's look at subordinate clauses and check out the underlying grammar. A subordinate clause of time creates a sort of temporal frame for the main or matrix clause. Note specifically that words like while or whilst inherently require a durative situation. What does that mean? Well, you can say they arrived while I was sunbathing because sunbathing takes a while. It has continuous duration, which gives us a wide enough window for the arrival to actually happen. On the flip side, as long as strongly emphasizes strict duration from a precise start to a precise finish, it perfectly mirrors the matrix clause, like he'll continue working so long as he has the strength. And then, of course, we have as for just simple, fleeting simultaneity, like, as I drove away, I saw them waving.
Look at this climactic when clause. It really shows that simultaneity isn't just cold mathematical logic. It's an incredibly vital narrative tool. Here, the matrix verb, I was watching television, is placed in the progressive aspect. This intentionally sets up a calm, continuous, durative scene for one reason only, so the subordinate when clause can introduce a sudden, dramatic interruption. You almost have to read it with a bit of dramatic flair, right? I was watching television when suddenly the lights went out. It's a classic storytelling device, and it relies entirely on a sudden overlap in the timeline.
All right, Section 3, Anteriority. Let's look at how we establish chronological sequences before a reference point.
Diving into our second pillar, anteriority, we're analyzing the tools we use to sequence events that happen before something else. Now, pay attention to this because it's a huge aha moment, especially for language teachers. Grammatically, until demands a durative matrix clause. You can easily say the children were noisy until told to be quiet because being noisy is a continuous state. But wait, what about negative clauses? Why does the sentence, I didn't start my meal until Adam arrived, work perfectly?
Starting a meal is a momentary action, right? Well, it works because negative clauses are inherently durative. Think about it. The complete absence of an action, the state of not eating, extends continuously right up to the boundary of Adam arriving. Before, however, doesn't care about duration. It simply marks a cutoff time, whether the main action has duration or not.
Before clauses also have these fascinating non-factual properties. In these structures, the situation in the subordinate clause isn't actually presupposed to be true. In fact, it might never happen at all. Why? Because the event in the matrix clause intercepts the timeline before the subordinate event can actually happen. This brilliantly lets us express preference, like he'll beg for food before he'll ask for money. It allows for deep implausibility, hence the classic idiom, pigs will fly before I agree to that, and it expertly expresses prevention, like go before I call the police. The temporal marker before is basically generating an alternate hypothetical timeline here. How cool is that?
And anteriority isn't just about syntax and clauses, it's baked right into the morphology. We literally construct time into our vocabulary using some wonderfully precise prefixes. We've got the standard pre, like in pre-war, but then we have ante, which brings a much more learned neoclassical register towards like antediluvian or antenatal. And we definitely can't forget the dramatic for, which beautifully shows precedence in verbs like foretell and foreshadow. Mixing up these etymologies, like imagine saying pre-shadow instead of foreshadow, it just sounds deeply unnatural to a native speaker. And that is exactly why mastering morphology matters so much at this advanced level.
Okay, section 4 brings us to posteriority, and how we talk about sequences that follow our reference point.
So our third pillar, posteriority. These are the linguistic mechanisms we use to build sequence and succession into our discourse. While after is for sure the go-to preposition, if you're operating in formal C2 registers, you need to elevate your vocabulary. Using following or subsequent to establishes a completely different semantic weight. Just compare saying after the crime with subsequent to the offense. The second one instantly creates a much clearer, more authoritative tone of formal succession that you absolutely need for academic or legal writing.
Beyond those basic prepositions, English gives us some highly specialized constructions that add incredible layers of nuance. Proximity indicators like as soon as or directly don't just say something happened later, they emphasize extreme temporal closeness. Then there are two infinitive clauses. When you pair them with certain verbs, they elegantly express an eventual outcome, like she lived to be 100. And let's look at ing participle clauses. These establish precise time relationships using subject ellipsis, meaning we actually drop the subject in the dependent clause to avoid being repetitive. Returning to my village, I met an old teacher. The implied subject doing the returning is obviously I. It's a total hallmark of sophisticated writing. And of course, we have the prefix post to mirror our earlier anterior prefixes.
Section 5. Let's bring this all together with some pedagogical and practical applications.
Finally, we're transitioning to the real world, the EOI classroom and professional contexts, because it's so important to ground all this abstract grammar in actual empirical data. Drawing on linguistic frequency data from major grammarians like Biber, we uncover a crucial insight for educators. If you want to master time in English, you absolutely must focus heavily on clauses and prepositional phrases. Why? Because they make up a massive 65% of temporal expressions in the language. Morphological prefixation is only about 10%. So, as teachers and learners, the takeaway is clear. Our main focus has to be relentlessly on syntactic structures, not just memorizing lists of vocabulary prefixes.
For advanced learners, recognizing the register shift between formal and informal English is absolutely vital. And surprisingly, it's deeply rooted in history. After the Norman conquest back in 1066, French, and by extension Latin, became the language of the elite, the law, and academia. That is exactly why formal English today leans heavily on complex Latinate vocabulary like prior to the meeting or subsequent to our conversation. Meanwhile, informal conversational English relies almost entirely on the simpler, older Germanic structures of the common people, before the meeting, after we talked. If you use a highly Latinate phrase in a casual setting, you'll sound incredibly stiff. But if you use basic Germanic prepositions in a corporate legal document, it might completely lack the required formal precision.
Out in the professional world, this level of temporal precision is just non-negotiable. In academic writing, you need these markers to structure arguments chronologically. In business communication, mastering these structures is literally the backbone of project management. And just think about legal English. Imagine a contract stating a tenant has before Friday to pay rent versus
until Friday. If before implies Thursday at midnight, but until implies Friday is included, confusing the two could result in a $1 million loophole. The exact definition of a deadline hinges entirely on mastering anteriority.
The expression of simultaneity, anteriority, and posteriority is a true testament to the English language's capacity for incredible, almost mathematical nuance. By utilizing a diverse array of prepositions, subordinators, and prefixes, we have the tools to construct intricate narratives and really rigorous academic arguments. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. How are you going to take this deep, structural understanding of English time, these distinct hues of meaning, and use it to transform your own communication or your own language teaching, starting today?